This is Professor Grodman, and this is a review for Exam 3, Psych 111. We're going to talk about intelligence and personality theories. Intelligence, dealing with Chapter 8, is in the textbook. Personality theories are listed on Blackboard and spelled out pretty well on Blackboard, I think, but certainly this will also aid in your understanding of that area, which you'll see again also, or both these areas you'll see on Exam 4. The book defines intelligence as really multidimensional. Dealing with many things, particularly cognitive things, reasoning, problem solving, understanding complex ideas, the ability to do things quickly as part of an IQ test, at least today. The notion of IQ goes back over 100 years to France. Simon and Binet, B-I-N-E-T, were the first developers of an IQ test. And they compared one's mental age with one's chronological age. So if your mental age was 8 and your chronological age was 5, you were very bright. You had a high IQ. If your mental age was 6 and chronological age 10, you had a low IQ. And they had a formula. I think they multiplied these figures by 100 and came up with an IQ. Today, intelligence is, the term IQ is used, but the actual intelligence score, IQ score, is a comparison of your individual performance with data driven or gotten derived from large groups of people of your similar age, your cohort group. So your performance is compared to theirs on overall IQ and on the mini tests or subtests that make up IQ tests, or the sections of an IQ test. Typically, IQ tests involve verbal IQ and nonverbal IQ, and sort of the averaging of the two. They may have added a section or two, but essentially for the past 50 years, IQ has to do with some evaluation of both your verbal and nonverbal intelligence. Nonverbal things like what's missing from a picture, or putting blocks together so they match they match a geometric design, or cubes actually. Putting pictures in a certain order so a story makes sense. These are all examples of nonverbal intelligence. Verbal intelligence is considered your general knowledge, your vocabulary, memory, things that some math ability, basic math ability. These are things that are considered much more verbal in nature. And one of the limitations of IQ tests is they only look at really a subset of intelligence. Howard Gardner, who's a more contemporary person, talks about multiple intelligences. We have linguistic intelligence, logical, interpersonal. That's sort of the emotional intelligence that is sort of gained a lot of recognition today. And also even physical intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, things that deal with movement and physicality. And some IQ tests, like the Stanford Binet IQ test, which is the second most commonly used test today, does have some measure of something physical in it. But largely IQ is, again, that term is used today, although that quotient is no longer employed. It has to do with more school-related learning, sometimes called cognitive intelligence. And though emotional intelligence is very important, your understanding of yourself and your perception of things around you, the accuracy of that, is highly important. It is very hard to measure. Intelligence tests are considered aptitude tests, what your potential is. An SAT is theoretically an aptitude test. And I say theoretically because they measure much more than the ability to learn. SATs and IQ tests, they also measure what you have learned. I mentioned before the Stanford Binet intelligence test. That's the second most commonly used IQ test. The most commonly used tests are the Wechsler test, Wechsler. There are 3 versions: a preschool, a school age, and an adult version. And these are all individually administered tests, both the Binet and the more commonly used Wechsler tests. And a score is derived. 100 is an average. Most people, regardless of age, score between 85 and 115. 100 is the national average. Specifically, 68% of people score between 85 and 115. The question is, are these tests actually measuring what they claim to? And the answer is, sort of. They're moderately doing that, or moderately valid. Valid is, are they measuring what they claim to? Are they accurate? Well, they're accurate to a degree. They're measuring aspects of intelligence, not the whole deal. But they tend to be more, these tests like the Binet and the Wechsler, more reliable, more consistent. So reliability or consistency is better than validity with regard to these tests. So again, just to review, a general idea of intelligence has to do with multiple, largely in terms of testable intelligence, verbal and nonverbal, but cognitive tasks, problem solving, vocabulary, general knowledge, understanding complex ideas. But a lot of it really is more school related. It's supposed to deal with more the ability to negotiate your world and to problem solve, and I guess that was the original definition. But most IQ tests don't do all these things. But that is theoretically that was our initial definition of intelligence. But these tests that's why they're only moderately valid, because they don't get at all these characteristics. IQ was a term associated with Binet and Simon, comparing mental age with chronological age. The more contemporary view, articulated by Gardner, speaks of multiple intelligences: linguistic, bodily or kinesthetic intelligence, mathematical, logical, interpersonal, emotional. Emotional intelligence, your understanding of yourself and the world around you. IQ is your comparison of how you do your performance in relation to people in your cohort group, your age group, not just in your school or community, but overall, nationwide. And they're considered, IQ and SATs are considered aptitude tests, the ability to learn. In terms of the distribution of scores on an IQ test, like the Wechsler, most commonly derived or commonly employed IQ test, and again there are three Wechslers: preschool, school age, and adult. And the second most commonly employed, the Stanford Binet. The average score is 100. Actually, on the Wechsler, 68% of people score between 85 and 115. The Binet is maybe slightly different. I would ask the question in regard to the Wechsler because it's more commonly used. And the tests, both of Binet and Wechsler, and a few others that are used, there aren't many that are used, it's largely the Wechsler, are more reliable, consistent than valid, accurate. Let's talk about personality theories. Personality, by definition, this is material outside of your textbook. Personality, by definition, has to do with some assumption of consistent behavior over time and across situations. In terms of psychology, I guess the foundational personality model was Freud's 5 stages of psychosexual development. The oral, anal, phallic, PHALLIC, latency, and genital stages. The oral having to do with the mouth and nursing. The anal, around orals in the first year of life. The anal at age 2 with toilet training. 3 to 5 associated with the phallic stage, where the child has a fascination with the opposite sex parent. For little boys, it's the Oedipus complex. This is called that. And for little girls, it's referred to as the Electra complex. 6 to 11 ages. 6 to 11, Freud articulates that it is, he calls this latency, when sexual matters are sort of on the back burner. And if there are issues with getting too much or too little, particularly in the first few stages of the psychosexual model, you may get stuck or, again, fixated, and start seeing evidence of this in adolescence or beyond. You eat too much, you're fixated in the oral stage. You're too neat or too sloppy, you're fixated in the anal stage. There's really no validity to this based on today's science or research, but it is a foundational model. Freud said this is basically unconscious, and most of Freud's model deals with the unconscious, not 100%, but largely. And he talked about the fact that we have these sexual and aggressive impulses, and we have to deal with them, cope with them, ward them away. And how do we do it? Well, we say that they don't happen. Denial. We justify them. I'm glad I justify something. I'm glad I didn't get that job. It would have been too much work anyway. Rationalization. Denial is the first. It's the most primitive, according to Freud. Rationalization, I just mentioned. The justification, Freud mentions that is the most sophisticated. Freud was quite cynical, quite negative. He would see things like productivity at work or in other arenas of life that are productive as rather forms of sublimation, where you take sexual energy and you redirect them, channel them into non-sexual arenas. The unconscious blocking out of memory, he calls this repression. The conscious blocking out, suppression. So there's an element of consciousness here with these defenses. Freud also notes that These defenses are normal to a point. If they're used excessively, then they work against you. You don't like something about yourself, you put it onto someone else. That's called projection. We hear a lot about that in the news today. And there's something called reaction formation, where you sort of do the opposite of what your impulse is. So you're very aggressive by nature, and so you become an anti-war activist, or you do something that involves peace and a lack of aggression. Shakespeare, and who influenced Freud and many others, talked about thou dost protest too much. If you're really making a claim against something, according to Freud, you're really probably, and Shakespeare maybe on some level also, even at a very conscious level, that there's something there you're attracted to. So that would be in concert with what both Shakespeare and Freud talked about. Freud also develops the first psychotherapy called psychoanalysis, and the key here is to bring the unconscious to the conscious level. How do you do it? Well, there are varying techniques. Someone misses an appointment or doesn't pay, and he says this is resistance, because they're resisting this very, very intense treatment, psychoanalysis, where you're trying to figure out what's going on in your head and your childhood, all this stuff. And so it's normal to resist, but the analyst's job is to analyze this. This is analysis of resistance. Freud found personally that people had very strong, as an analyst, he was the first analyst, and people had very strong opinions of him and very strong reactions to him. He called this transference, and he said that it actually wasn't their reaction to him, it was more they were transferring their feelings toward their parents onto him. And this is transference. Either you do it positively, you're great, or you're awful. That's a negative transference, the latter. Freud said dream interpretation is part of certainly uncovering the unconscious, and even a technique like saying a word, the next word that comes to mind, that's free association, another pathway to the unconscious. There are Neo-Freudians, people who were influenced by Freud but departed from his model some. One of them is Erik Erikson, and he developed not 5 stages of development, but 8 stages. And he called them 8 stages of not psychosexual, but 8 stages of psychosocial development. 8 stages of psychosocial development. And with each stage, there's an associated issue or crisis. Infancy, you're going to, and these will form personality. Infancy, you're either going to develop a sense of trust or not, mistrust. 2 years of age, you're going to feel autonomous. That's really healthy. That's a successful resolution. Or unsuccessfully, you're going to feel shame and doubt. And this stuff forms you, and it doesn't mean that you're stuck. It's not a static theory. There's a dynamic aspect. So you can go back, in time. As an older person at 40, you might be able to deal with trust issues. But it's harder the older you get, but it is possible. It is achievable. So there's a flexibility to this model. 3 to 5 years of age, the psychosocial crisis, the successful resolution, initiative. If you don't resolve it successfully, guilt. 6 to 11, school age, you're going to feel industry. You're going to feel competence, or you're going to feel inferior or inadequate. He thought identity, a sense of who you are, where you're going, what's important to you, is established in adolescence. That's not the view today, but he called it, he thought it was then in the 1930s when he had formulated this model, Erikson. And he referred to the psychosocial crisis here as identity versus, if you don't have it, role confusion. It was Erikson's view that from 20 to 40, it's very normative to establish intimate relationships with other people outside your family of origin. Calls this intimacy. If you don't do this, you'll be isolated. In middle adulthood, from 40 to 65, the issue is, are you going to give back to the next generation? That's healthy. That's very life-affirming and helps shape you in a positive sense. Or are you going to stagnate, where it's all about you and you don't grow? And finally, are you going to look back upon life at 65 plus and feel good about your life, ego integrity, or feel terrible, despair? These are very binary, sort of simplistic models. Also, the notion of 65 plus, where people live to 100, it's a very broad period. So is all of adulthood. He has 3 periods from 20 on. People didn't live as long then, but it's very much a childhood-based model in terms of top-heavy in that way. One more stage model, and this was developed in the 1960s, by a developmental psychologist at Harvard. His name was Lawrence Kohlberg, and he talks about 3 levels of moral reasoning. The most basic level, which is consistent with what you experience when you're a small child, 3-4 years of age, it has to do with self-interest. If you can take the cookie and not get yelled for stealing it or taking it, you'll do it. That's pre-conventional moral reasoning. Most of us starting in probably 7, 8, 9 in elementary school age, we start to reason in a way that is really not all that complicated. We just sort of adhere to the social mores, the rules, and most of our lives, if not virtually our whole life, this is how we operate. This is called conventional moral reasoning. There's a green light, we go, a red light, we stop. As simple as that, as an example. But he says that moral decisions can be more sophisticated. They can be based on the greater good rather than just self-interest or going along with sort of the rules and mores of society. But to do this, to think beyond oneself, requires some education and some abstract thinking, to be able to think philosophically and scientifically. And most people don't achieve this. Part of it is intellectual, but also part of it is they just don't achieve it morally. And so your decisions, if you are a post-conventional moral reasoner or thinker, are based not for your self-interest, but for the greater good. I want to pay more taxes because it'll help society. I come second, given where I'm in a good place. I'm more concerned for other people and the rightness, the justice of that, the equality of that, and that's post-conventional moral reasoning. It was his view that most people do not achieve this. We're going to finish this off and talk about some basic streamlined theories espoused by, a number of different folks. Bandura, remember Albert Bandura, the pioneer of social learning theory? Well, he comes up with a term called self-efficacy, that this relates to one's sense or perception of one's competence. And if you feel you're good in something, and you get feedback to that effect, and you tell people, and you compare yourself to others, and you feel favorable, you're going to have high self-efficacy. It's not the same as self-esteem, but it correlates with self-esteem. And you're not going to feel self-efficacious or high self-efficacy in everything. But one or two things will increase self-efficacy and correlate with higher self-esteem. If you don't have low self-efficacy, you're probably going to have low self-esteem. This is Albert Bandura. So these are very, very sort of direct to the point. Julian Rotter talked about locus of control. There are two types: internal locus of control and external locus of control. Internal, you control your own destiny, you study hard, you do well. External, luck, happenstance, external factors control outcomes in your life. That's not good. That makes you feel anxious or depressed. You can go from an external locus of control to an internal. Change your job, change your major, make some change in your life. And those are important in terms of psychological well-being. Carl Rogers talked about the need for affirmation, regard from others. Two ways we can get this. Ideally, unconditionally, we're loved regardless of our behavior. But the reality is, many times there are strings attached. There are conditions. And so we may be loved conditionally, regarded. You make money, you appease people, you make them feel good. If you don't do it, you're not going to probably get regarded. And so you take this conditional positive regard over nothing at all. A model that deals with personality in a broader sense is called the 5-factor model, or the Big Five. And they broke down and synthesized on something like 96 personality characteristics, into 5. And it helps to have the mnemonic OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. OCEAN, the O is for openness to new ideas. C, the conscientiousness has to do with discipline. E, extroversion, being outgoing. Discipline with work, by the way, and that sort of thing. A, agreeableness, being friendly. These are all positive characteristics. Sort of a surprise in psychology, which tends to focus more on the negative. And only one trait is considered a negative one, and that is neuroticism, emotional instability, and worry. So the 5 traits: openness, connect to the OCEAN model; conscientiousness, self-discipline; extroversion, being outgoing; agreeable, friendly, or neuroticism, emotional instability, and worry. 2 more models that, again, are very streamlined. Abraham Maslow, we talked about this earlier in the semester, hierarchy of needs model. Your basic needs are physiological, level 1. Level 2, safety, a roof over your head. If you don't have these, you're probably not going to be concerned about anything else. If you do have them, then you can think about level 3, love and belonging, relationships, or even work, achievement, level 4, or esteem. Very few people, however, get to the highest level of this pyramid, referred to as self-actualization. This is self-fulfillment, expressing yourself in a unique way, being self-aware. Psychology has a lot to do with the individual. It's not collectivistic in its focus. It's much more individualistic in its emphasis. And this model definitely is in line with that. That you feel good about yourself. You're at peace with yourself. You're self-aware, and your relationships are not many, but they're substantive. There's great depth. And when something wonderful happens, you enjoy it. You have peak experiences. Well, when you think about these qualities, they're not so commonplace. And so according to Maslow, most people, some do, but most people never achieve this for a number of reasons. They don't have the opportunity, or they just never move up the hierarchy psychologically. Finally, we have one more theory. It's Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory. And pretty basic. Festinger developed this in the 1950s. He was a social psychologist. And dissonance has to do with psychological discomfort. And he says if you have psychological discomfort, you're motivated to change it. Okay, so how do you change it? Well, either you change your thinking or your behavior. So you don't like your job. Either you could change your thinking about the job, or you can look for a new job. Either or both will help you likely reduce dissonance. So again, in terms of personality, I would go through and know the 5 stages of psychosexual development, the defense mechanisms associated with Freud, the first therapy, psychoanalysis, and the techniques associated with it, Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. By the way, Freud's were 5 stages of psychosexual development. And finally, as a stage theory, Kohlberg's 3 levels of moral reasoning, pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Should know Bandura's self-efficacy with competence, model looking at how one's competence, not confidence, but competence. Rotter's locus of control, either internal or external. Internal associated with better psychological well-being, external a lack of psychological well-being. Rogers talked about affirmation or positive regard. You prefer unconditional, but you'll take conditional. The 5-factor model, or the Big 5, the ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Maslow's a hierarchy of needs, the 5 levels: physiological, safety, love and belonging, achievement/esteem, and self-actualization. Most people never are not self-actualized. And finally, Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory. When we have psychological discomfort or dissonance, we're motivated to reduce it, either by changing thinking or behavior. That's about it, and good luck with exam 3.